Seeing my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. Does that come up?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So, like Hamna said, my name's Hannah. I am a medical student at King's College London. I also volunteer for Aafiyah Project, which is a Muslim mental health organisation. I also work as a mental health healthcare assistant. So I've been in a few mental health institutes for the last couple of months, just supporting people there. So I have a bit of a varied experience, you can say. So today's talk, inshallah, is going to be about trauma, the truth, the bad and the ugly. So a bit of an overview into trauma, its causes and the different treatments that are available. So this is the content that we're going to go through. So we're going to go through the different types of trauma, the complexity of it, the causes and effects on the brain and body, what are ACE scores, some protective factors, methods of healing and support link, and then we'll do a mood lifter at the end. Am I going too fast, by the way? Sorry, I have a tendency to speak really fast.
No, you're good.
No? All right, brilliant. So if we just go through some ground rules and safety netting. So we are going to be discussing triggering topics today. You may be listening to this talk and realize actually you've been through trauma, and that is quite a process in itself. So as a result, we're going to be taking regular thought breaks, inshallah. So please feel free to leave or take a pause if it's too much. There's nothing graphic here at all, but it's just like the topic is a very unsavory one. So, you might feel a bit overwhelmed, which is totally fine. So, feel free to take a pause. These kind of talks are a bit difficult to do in person, over Zoom or online, just because if we were in person, I would have like a few people in the audience who could just pick up on if anyone's feeling a bit uncomfortable and be able to have a chat with them. Whereas like with this online system, if you're having a panic attack, like I can't support you. So it's a bit frustrating from that point of view, but we're going to try our best, inshallah. I also want to ask whatever is discussed here, if it can stay here, please. I think with the recording, I'm not sure if you guys could just maybe pause out the bits where people speak or towards the end when people ask questions. And also please don't share anything that you're not comfortable with. And at the end, I'm going to be providing some support links, and we're going to give out, Homna, I'm going to give you out a pack basically to give back to the audience, which will have books and support links and everything there, inshallah. So yeah, let's get started. So also one thing, can I ask some of you guys to switch on your camera just so I can like have visual cues of how people are responding? I can only see Hamna now on my screen. I really hate to be that person, but if it's okay, if you can switch on your camera, that would really help me just kind of gauge people's reactions. Thank you. I see a few of you switching yours on. Brilliant. Let me just. Okay, I can put this to the side. Okay. 1 second. Oh, sorry guys, technical difficulties. Okay, never mind. That should work. Okay, so the definition of trauma. Oh, let me take this off. Sorry, I'm not going to get you on my screen. So trauma is defined as, so at the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. The severity of traumatic events cannot be measured on any single dimension. Simplistic efforts to quantify trauma ultimately lead to meaningless comparisons of horror. The salient characteristics of the traumatic event is its power to inspire helplessness and terror. So this is one of the best definitions I found out there about trauma, purely because the main point is not necessarily what someone goes through, is how they perceive the threat. So, and we'll come across this later as well, but many people will go through a stressful period but may not develop trauma as a result of it. So it's a very sort of individualistic process. So I'm gonna ask everyone if they can either unmute themselves or type it in the chat. What do you think causes trauma? And I'll type up here. You guys are still seeing my screen, yeah? Hamna, you still seeing my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Brilliant. Okay, if you guys want to shout out or type it in the chat, what do you think causes trauma?
We've got some stuff coming through the chat. So
can you read them out for me, Hamna? Because I don't have access.
Toxic environment.
Good. Toxic environments. What else?
Violence,
Violence, good.
abuse,
Violence, abuse, ignore the horrible spelling, please. Abuse, yep.
it also had negative childhood experiences,
Good. Childhood, brilliant. What else?
controlling and coercive behavior,
What else?
neglect,
That's a big one.
being invalidated,
Brilliant.
sexual abuse,
Good, very good.
childhood trauma,
Yeah, negative childhood, that would go with that.
bullying,
Yeah, definitely. Is that it?
physical or mental abuse.
Yeah, brilliant. Let's put mental abuse there. Okay, well done. So you guys have a good grasp and understanding of trauma, which is brilliant, mashallah. Okay. So, causes of trauma. So trauma is something that you can either experience or witness. Oops, let me go back. Sorry. So you either experience or witness, and it can be physical abuse, sexual abuse or sexual assault, domestic abuse or domestic violence or community violence, emotional abuse, neglect, parental mental health issues. If your parents suffered from different types of mental health problems, that also causes trauma. So if your parents have been institutionalized, so either in jail or if they've been in like rehab, or even if they've gone to mental health institutes themselves, natural disasters, sudden death and violent death of a loved one, and witnessing a war or a genocide. So those are pretty standard causes of trauma. And it's actually a lot more common than we think. So there's an estimate that about 50 to 80% of people will experience a trauma, but not everyone will develop a traumatic disorder or a trauma disorder. So it's very normal to go through challenges in life, and challenges that will knock us off our feet. That's, I guess just a part of being human. But the difference is that trauma, developing traumatic responses afterwards, is that whatever you've been through has had a significant impact on you. Okay, so this trauma is grouped into 3 types. So you have acute. So it's acute is a single stressful or dangerous event. So this would be something like a car crash, like a violent assault, like a random one, for example, something that's quite sudden and it's a singular event. So chronic trauma is a result of repeated and prolonged exposure to highly stressful events. So this would be something like child abuse, bullying, domestic violence. So it has a long period. And complex trauma is when you have a mix of multiple traumatic events. And complex trauma is often starts in childhood. So it's experiencing lots of different things in childhood. And also complex trauma is, you find that often when the caregiver is the abuser, so your parent or whoever's supposed to be looking after you when they abuse you, that is also a type of complex trauma because you're supposed to be getting love and validation and safety from this person when you're not. So that causes a bit of a problem. Okay, so we also have little t's of trauma. So it's experiences that leave someone feeling hopeless. So they are distressing events that can be beyond a person's ability to cope, but do not necessarily cause life-threatening or bodily threatening outcomes. So little t traumas would include things like divorce, legal trouble, having a child, conflict with boss, bullying, lack of stability. And the idea is that with little t's, you have an accumulation of events, which then leads to a traumatic response. So imagine if you've just gotten a divorce, you've just had a child, and then a month later you've gotten a divorce. And then as a result of your divorce, you are now financially unstable and you're on the verge of being homeless. Like these events isolated, so like having a child on its own, or like being homeless on its own, or getting a divorce on its own is tough, but kind of manageable. But when you kind of have everything together back to back, then it does accumulate. So we're just going to take a little break here. I'm going to see if I can see everyone. So many people. Okay, so can I just ask you all to just relax your shoulders, roll your shoulders back a little bit. And I'm going to do this constantly throughout our talk just to kind of break up our thought pattern a little bit. If I can ask everyone to stand up. Sorry, I'm going to be that annoying person, but it does help. So if I can ask everyone to stand up, please. Thank you. For those of you who got your cameras on, good. And thank you. That's just to kind of get you moving a little bit. Also, if you look towards your door, just so you know where your exit is. Yeah, and that's all it is. Thank you. We're going to be doing that quite a bit, so just get yourselves ready. So when we talk about complex trauma or trauma complexity, often something that starts in childhood. So the issue with childhood trauma, so when you go through trauma as a child versus as an adult you have a certain level of resilience already built up and your brain is somewhat formed, yeah? So, you know, you have an understanding of ideas, you have a sense of self-worth. Obviously, you know, say for example, if we take sexual abuse, so if you have a child who's been assaulted and an adult, both of them obviously are very horrible experiences to have gone through, but as an adult, you have more coping mechanisms and you have a high level of resilience to deal with it than as a child. Because as a child, your brain is still developing. And what happens is that when you go through trauma in certain stages, like depending on the development period, it will affect the outcome of your behavior later on. So if you have a child, say between the ages of 2 and 4, and that's kind of, well, to be fair, earlier than that, you start developing attachment, but say you, and we'll talk about attachment later on, inshallah, but say, you know, as a child between 2 and 4, you've been through some sort of abuse or you've witnessed abuse like domestic violence, whatever, and your sense of attachment has been messed up. So your caregiver is not meeting your needs. What then happens is that as an adult, you will have negative traits that come as a result of whatever you've been through. So you have, and we'll talk about this later, inshallah, but you'll have adults who have issues with their attachment to others. So it just shows that the age and stage of onset of trauma really affects a child's brain development, memory, narrative, and biological, emotional, and cognitive capacities, and also affects its opportunities for recovery. So infants and toddlers are disproportionately at risk for maltreatment. And when you think of it, it's kind of funny because, like, who remembers what happened when they were a child, right? No one. You know, who can remember what happened to them at the age of 3? But it's really interesting to see actually what, you know, whatever you went through at that stage in life affects how you are now as an adult. And also, so children who go through trauma at that age also have a really good ability to bounce back. So if it's caught early and if it's managed and given the proper treatment, children can very easily bounce back. Did someone write a comment, Hanaa? Sorry, I can't see. If there's any questions coming.
I was just
Okay, no worries. If any questions come through, just let me know. So attachment. So the attachment is the building blocks of mental health foundation. So I really like this explanation of it. So it says investigations into the physiology of relatedness now tells us that attachment penetrates to the neural core of what it means to be a human being. So when trauma occurs in the presence of a caregiver, the child's response will mimic that of the parent. So the more disorganized the parent, the more disorganized the child. Talk about this as well. So types of attachment. So you have secure attachment, and if there's any medics here or like psychology students, you've probably come across this concept before, but you have 4 main types. The first one is secure attachment. So this is when your parent is available, they're sensitive, they're responding and accepting of you as a child. I'm not going to go into like loads of detail about this, but you can read up on it and see, you know, depending on whatever attachment you had as a child, what your relationships look like now as an adult. So I really recommend all of you guys after this talk, inshallah, just to Google like attachment style quiz, answer a few questions and see what is yours. And the next one is anxious insecure attachment. So this is when the parent responds to their child's needs sporadically. So the care and protection are sometimes there and sometimes not. And with children like this, you'll find them to be really, really clingy because they don't know how their care from their parent is not consistent. With secure attachment, so the way how they did this experiment was that they got a whole load of children and they had their caregiver with them in the room, and they just sort of saw how the child responded. And the child who had secure attachment could go and like play with all other toys. They would come back to their parent, but they would feel safe enough to be able to explore their surroundings. Whereas anxious and secure attachment children would just cling to their parents. They wouldn't let go and they'd just be crying. So avoidant insecure attachment is when the parent has trouble accepting and responding sensitively to their child's needs. So instead of comforting their child, the parent minimizes their feelings, rejects their demands, doesn't help with difficult tasks. So this type of child is super, super independent. So as soon as you put them in the room, they're not even looking at their parent because they're just going and doing whatever. And people like that who have that kind of attachment, they actually come across as really high functioning and really, you know, hyper independent. But it could actually be a sign of a problem with your attachment. And then you have the disorganized insecure attachment, which is when the parent shows atypical behavior. So they reject, ridicule, and frighten their child. The child in this case, sorry, someone just came in. The child in this case just shows really sort of abnormal reactions to a normal kid. Like the child might just be sitting there blankly. They might not show any kind of response. They might be crying. They might be really angry. They might show anger towards the caregiver. So yeah, the main point of this is that each has its own implications in how you then progress and function as an adult. So I'd really recommend you guys to look into that. So now we are going to talk about what are the normal reactions to trauma. So once again, if I ask you guys to either write in the chat or unmute yourselves, it'd be nice to hear some of you if you're comfortable. But what do you think the normal reactions to trauma are? So we've talked about what trauma is. If you've been through these situations, what do you think is the normal reaction?
Someone said being distant.
Mm-hmm.
Lashing out, so violence.
Yeah. Anger, violence, well done.
Avoidance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Feeling left out.
Not connecting. Mm-hmm.
Anxiety.
Yeah, definitely.
Sadness.
Mm-hmm.
Denial.
Brilliant, that's a very good one.
Intrusive thoughts.
Mm-hmm. You guys are on a roll, mashallah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Depression.
Yeah. So,
out of body experiences.
Really, really good. Well done. Okay. Let's stop there. Brilliant. Well done, mashallah, guys. Okay. So, reactions and symptoms of trauma. So yes, we had avoidance. So avoidance would be staying away from places, people, things that remind them of the traumatic event. So some people have like really weird phobias that just don't make sense. And you think, you know, it's just, for example, I've got a really good friend of mine who's just like deathly afraid of sauces. And it sounds so crazy to even say, but like we'll go to Nando's and she can't have any sauces in front of her. She'll literally throw up. And it's that sense of avoidance. And obviously that doesn't come from nowhere. You just don't develop that out of nowhere. And we've asked her about it loads of times, but she can't seem to pinpoint something. But if you have something like that, it's just like a really weird abnormal fear that you just don't get. I had another friend who had a deathly fear of vomit, which I think obviously vomit is not a pleasant thing anyways, but like a really deathly fear of it. And it turns out when she was a child, when she was a baby, she had whooping cough. And she would vomit like every hour and she would choke on her vomit a lot. And I think her mum or someone mentioned it to her in passing. And then she kind of made that link like, oh, I went through this as a child and as a result. And it's something that you don't even remember. Like who remembers they had whooping cough at like 2 years old, right? So yeah, that would be like a type of avoidance, avoiding something. Isolating yourself from one's family or friends. So someone who's been through trauma often experiences massive levels of shame and disgust with themselves, lots of self-hate. So as a result, you just isolate yourself from everyone because you feel like you kind of don't deserve to be in anyone's company. So intense fear and worrying. Anger, so anger either towards self, towards others or self. And there's loads of different forms of self-harm. I think we typically think of self-harm as cutting. Self-harm can be diet restriction, which wouldn't be anorexia because you're not trying to lose weight, you're just trying to restrict yourself, harm yourself in that way. It could also be lack of sleep. So if you punish yourself by just getting 3 hours of sleep a night and then having a full day afterwards, taking like an overdose, drug abuse, that sort of stuff. So there's lots of different types of self-harm. But yeah, so I mentioned that in all its forms. Intense sadness. So a lot of people who've experienced trauma and who have seemingly recovered from it and think that it doesn't affect them anymore often have like a really deep sense of sadness that they just don't know where it comes from. And it's often as a result of just unprocessed trauma. So you also have remembering the traumatic event. So you can either have flashbacks when seeing, hearing, or smelling something that reminds the child or youth about their experience. Memory block is also a really common symptom of trauma, where you just have a block of your childhood that you just don't remember. You know, so it might be so typically after the ages of 4 or 5, you should have some type of memory or be able to remember stuff. But some people just their whole teens is a blur. They don't remember that, and that is a sign of trauma as well. Substance abuse is very, 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 very common with those who've been through trauma. Purely just numb the pain, stop the buzzing in the head. It's not mentioned here, but anxiety is a massive one that comes with it as well. So yeah, drug abuse is something that you see a lot. So trauma will affect your attachment. We've mentioned that. It will affect your biology. So I'm not sure what kind of students are here, but in terms of the stress mechanism, so what happens is that stress is good, like stress keeps you alive, right? So back in the day when our ancestors had to like run away from lions or whatever, their body perceived the threat of a lion, and then stress hormones increase in their body, which allowed them adrenaline to be able to run away. So that's like it's basically your fight or flight, and that's what keeps you safe. So people who've been through trauma, that system is completely dysregulated. So what happens so people who haven't been through trauma, what happens is that you get stressed, your adrenal glands release cortisol that sends a message to your brain to stimulate whatever hormones to kind of, to give that reaction. So, your heartbeat will increase, your breathing will get deeper, you'll get like gut problems because you'll feel quite constricted. But then after the threat has passed, it goes back down to normal, yeah? So the hormone levels go back to its base. People who've been through really, really high levels of stress or trauma, that level, those hormone levels just stay constantly high. They get spiked and they get triggered really, really easily. And then it takes an even longer time for it to be able to come back down to the base. And it never gets down to the real base. It's sort of this fake base that has been created as a result of what they've been through. Poor sensory and motor coordination, and that's mainly because often trauma because of the lack of control of your situation, you would feel a lack of connectedness or lack of connection, with your body. So that can affect your sensory and your motor coordination. Also affects regulation, so your inability to experience, identify, express, modulate emotions. So you may be feeling, someone might say a word to you or something, someone might say something, and then you will just experience this wave of anger and you don't know where it comes from. What the person said isn't particularly offensive, and no one else has taken offense, but you have, and it's created this massive response in you. So maybe, it would be good to kind of dig deep and think, okay, but why did that trigger me so much? Why does that affect me that much? Also behavioral control, so too much or not enough inhibition. So too much inhibition would be like restricting yourself, being really harsh on yourself, which is a type of self-harm, and not enough inhibition would just be to kind of go off the rails, as they say, and drug abuse and all that sort of stuff. It also affects your cognition, so your basic understanding. If you are in high levels of stress, your cognition is going to be affected. You're not going to be able to sit exams, you're not going to be able to concentrate on work, you're not going to be able to have a long attention span. And also self-concept. So like I mentioned before, people who've been through trauma have a massive, massive sense of shame because often trauma is shrouded in secrecy. I'm sure there's about 31 people here. I'd say at least all of us have experienced some type of trauma, but no one's going to sit here and start expressing what they've been through because of the secrecy, right? So along with that comes a lot of shame, guilt, and there's a very high, because if you haven't been validated, if you haven't been told that you're a good person and that you're amazing and all this stuff as a child, like how are you supposed to tell yourself that as an adult? So in terms of the physical reactions, so you get a lot of headaches, digestive symptoms, and this is all related to the fight or flight and the hormones that are released, which trigger this. So we also have lots of fatigue, racing heart, sweating, feeling jumpy, hyperarousal, affects ability to function. So if you are in a constant state of hyperarousal where someone knocking on your door will wake you up, or someone walking outside your door will wake you up, how are you supposed to sleep? How are you supposed to get good sleep or uninterrupted sleep, right? Same thing with work. Individuals, so a really common thing as well is that lots of people go on to develop lots of other mental health issues. So if you've been suddenly diagnosed with anxiety or suddenly diagnosed with depression, often these things don't come out of nowhere. There is often, not always, but often there is a root cause of why you have suddenly developed anxiety, why you have suddenly developed depression. You've been fine for so long and all of a sudden, you're having these symptoms. So it would be worth to kind of explore that a little bit more. So behavioral reactions would be things like compulsion, eating disorders, impulsiveness, isolation, numbness, general disorientation. Am I making sense so far? Is there anything that doesn't make sense?
No, you're making sense so far.
Yeah.
I had a question come.
Yes.
said, how likely is it to develop multiple personality disorder from severe trauma?
So multiple personality disorder, or another word is DID, so dissociative identity disorder, is what happens when a child goes through an unimaginable level of trauma at a young age. So there's some really good documentaries out there so if you type in DID documentary, there's a really good one that I think was made about maybe 30 years ago or something. And it was about, trigger warning now, I'm going to talk about sexual abuse. So, you might want to mute me for the next 5 minutes. So there was this girl who was involved in, this woman who had multiple personalities. And you would literally see the switch on screen, where one instant she would be a child and then the next instant she would be an adult. And there's actually a really good YouTuber. She's a lady, a female YouTuber. She's got the DID and she does a lot of very informative videos about it. So you can check her out. And yeah, so the child goes through this trauma, and because, at that age, your brain is not developed enough to cope. So what happens is that you develop these different personalities to take on that pain. So when you see this lady, one of her personalities is very normal, like bubbly, talking to you fine. She has another personality who's a child. So that's the sense of, I wasn't able to be a child, so now this is the personality that's allowed to be a child. And then she had this personality who took all the pain. So even when that personality came through, you saw the difference. And this was the personality that took all the pain and actually remembered everything and saw everything. This was a personality that would harm her. So she had a lot of self-harm. And even, when you watch the documentary, the lady, she says, I'd wake up in places that I didn't know. I'd wake up and see cuts and burns all over myself. And she would have to go hunt in her house to find these razor blades that her other personality had hidden. And what happened to this poor lady was that when she was younger, her parents were involved in this sex cult, where basically there was a lot of child sacrifice and a lot of child abuse as part of their whole cult and their whole system. So there's no need to go into a lot of detail, but she went through the unimaginable pretty much. And they made her do a lot of things that, just thinking about kind of makes you sick. So as a result, her body has developed DID and DID is developed as a protective mechanism. That's your body protecting you. Because if you were to remember everything that happened to you at every point in time, you would not be able to cope. Mentally, you wouldn't be able to. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I just want to ask the other one as well.
Yeah.
Pretty relevant to because you just talk about the effects of trauma.
Yes.
How can you pinpoint that your behavior might be influenced by trauma?
So later on, inshallah, we're going to talk a little bit more about therapy and the different signs, and we're also going to mention signs of unhealed trauma. But I think therapy is always a really good place to start. If you feel like there's something wrong or there's something off, usually there is, no one likes to accept that they have a problem with themselves, right? So the fact that you do means that there's a high chance something actually did happen and something is bothering you. And often we see trauma as a really, sort of big, scary thing that changes your life imaginably. But actually, when you think of it, a lot of us go through trauma, and when you think of children of ethnic minorities, our parents have been through their own trauma in their own country, and then they came here, and the whole trauma of settling into this life and having racism and all this stuff. And then they try to raise you through that. Obviously, they're going to project a lot of their stuff onto you. So I think most ethnic minority children have some sort of issue. But the first step is to recognize that you do, and then to get help. There's being aware of it is always the first step. And there's so much, I'm going to list it later on, inshallah, but there's just so much support and help that you can get. And just to know actually that you're not alone. It's very, unfortunately, it's very, very, very common. And the great thing is that you've picked it up at this age. So I'm assuming everyone is in their early 20s. You've picked it up at this age, so you know what you can work on and you know what you can do, rather than wait until you're in your 50s and you messed up your children's lives and then oh, there might be something wrong with me kind of thing. So yeah, does that answer the question, Hamna?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Brilliant. We're going to have a time for questions at the end as well. Inshallah, if you guys want to ask anything then too. Okay, yeah, so exactly, signs of unhealed trauma. So low sense of self-worth, codependency in relationships, fear of being abandoned because that's what happened to you as a child, putting your needs aside for others. So in other words, people pleasing. If you're a people's pleaser and you allow everyone to walk over you, why do you think that is? You kind of have to ask yourself that a little bit. Craving for external validation because you were never validated as a child. You were never felt, no one ever told you that you were enough. So you always have to kind of get that from others. An innate feeling of shame. Zero tolerance of conflict. So conflict is not a bad thing. Can I just say, having problems with people is not a bad thing, because you learn how to communicate, you learn how to put your needs, you learn how to assert yourself. That's not a problem. The problem is how you go about conflict. Some people are completely avoidant. Some people are very aggressive and very assertive. So it depends how you go about it, but conflict in itself is not a bad thing, right? That's how we grow and that's how we learn about each other. Fearing what might happen next. So if you're a bit of a negative Nelly and everything is always bad, or you could be going through a really good moment right now and you're like, oh, when is this going to end? Like, I know something bad's going to happen. It's just kind of that negative perception. Resisting positive change, so self-sabotage. Whenever anything goes good in your life, you have to sabotage it in some sort of way. You've just received, someone's just invited you to work on this certain project that you've been really passionate about, and then the last minute you cancel because you don't think you're going to be good enough, or you just don't send in the application, or you delay it, or you procrastinate, whatever. So these would be kind of examples of self-sabotage. Difficulties asserting boundaries because all your life your boundaries have just been disregarded. So when you now want to speak with people and you're working and you want to say, actually, that's not okay, or actually, I don't really like that, you find that really difficult. And that kind of ties in with tolerating abuse. So a lot of people who've been through some type of trauma, especially women, will gravitate towards abusive partners, unfortunately. And it's because that's their normal. Like if you've seen domestic violence all your life, and for you, that is your normal, that is your reality, you run away from healthy relationships because that's not what you know. And you go for the negative. All right, break. So if I can ask everyone again to please stand up, give a bit of a stretch up, touch the floor. Let's see if I can still do that. Brilliant. Roll your shoulders a little bit back and forward. If you're clenching your jaw, relax that jaw and massage over here. If your tongue is stuck to the roof of your mouth, just relax it a little bit. These are all signs of tension that are held in the body. Look towards your exit. That's your door. If you need to leave, you can. Yeah? Brilliant. Okie dokie. So, ACE scores. Has anyone heard of ACE scores? Can you unmute yourself and just say yes or no? Or write it in the chat.
No.
No? Okay. So, ACE scores. So it was initially in 1998, there was research done about childhood obesity, and they were trying to find the reasons for childhood obesity or something like that. And as a result, accidentally, they discovered ACE scores, which is adverse childhood experience. So what these researchers, and the researchers, their population was sort of middle class white people, which is not a problem because most people go through this. And they basically looked at the different types of trauma that people go through and then their likelihood of developing health problems afterwards. So what came out of the study was that there is a direct link between childhood trauma and an adult onset of chronic disease, as well as depression, suicide, being violent, and a victim of violence. So more types of trauma increase the risk of health, social, and emotional problems. People usually experience more than one type of trauma. Rarely is it only sex abuse or only verbal abuse. So if you see over here, there are 3 types of ACE. So you have abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. And it's a quiz. So if you go online and you type in ACE quiz, you can do it yourself. And it's things like, okay, before the age of 18, have you ever seen or been the victim of physical aggression or have, emotional, sexual, whatever. Neglect, emotional, and then household dysfunction. Did you grow up in a household where someone was incarcerated? Did you grow up in a household where someone abused substances? Yeah, or your mom was treated violently or divorced? And obviously there's a lot more types of trauma, but in this type of research, these were the ones that were studied, yeah? Because obviously bullying and all this other stuff will have an effect, but this is kind of what was studied. And to be fair, it's a pretty old study. But yeah, so this was the results from the ACE scores. So what happened is that depending on so what they did, they got people's ACE scores and then they followed them after a certain amount of time and then saw their chances of developing a certain type. No, actually, they did it the other way. So they had people who had, for example, COPD, which is a respiratory disease, and they measured their ACE scores. And it turns out the higher your ACE score is, the more likely you are to have COPD. Yeah, percent with problem, which is crazy because COPD is a respiratory disease. And you think, like, what does your breathing have to have with you going through trauma? You know, but subhanAllah, that really shows you the link between sort of mind, body, brain, and soul. And then you have here childhood experiences versus adult alcoholism. So depending on however many ACEs you've gone through, this is the chances, likelihood of you developing or you becoming an alcoholic yourself. Yeah. So I've mentioned a lot of sort of really scary and really unsettling things or really unsavory things. But with ACE scores, you also have something called protective factors, which allow you to build resilience. So protective factors are things in your life that protect you, prevent symptoms of mental health developing further. Yeah, so it maintains your mental health. So you can go through a traumatic event as a child, but if you have protective factors, you're less likely to have these outcomes. Okay. So good parenting. So if you had a nurturing home environment, good education and emotional literacy, communication skills, social networks. If you have a strong social network, is a massive protective factor for developing mental health. Because, you know, no matter what conditions you have, if you have supportive friends who check on you, who ask about you, you know, that is going to support your mood in some sort of way. Yeah. Self-esteem. If you've got a good level of self-esteem as well. If you have a good understanding of mental health, so stable job and savings, that make that, you know, without being said. Family contribution, so whatever your role is in your family, and also religion. And I really wanted to stress this point. So religion is a massive protective factor for mental health. And there was research done about drug abuse, where people who had been through trauma, so they looked at everyone who'd been through trauma and then whether they abused drugs as a result. And for those who didn't, their number one protecting factor was actually religion. The fact that they were religious, that they believed in God, and they believed, you know, harming their body is not good, etc. So, you know, Islam, not just Islam, but like any religion, will really help with your, really gives you a level of protection, you know, because if you're at a stage where you're like, oh, I've just had enough, I can't deal with it, I'm going to go and, you know, I'm going to rebel, or I'm going to, you know, let loose, or I'm going to go off the rails. And you kind of think, well, actually, you know, I wear a hijab. Do I really want to go out without a hijab? Or do I really want to go out and take drugs like this? Or do I really want to drink alcohol? You know, like you have a whole system in your mind that will then prevent you from doing it. So yeah, I just wanted to really stress that point. Another break. We're nearly to the end now. Sorry, we've got about 5 minutes left. So stretching up to the side, up. I will make you go up this time. Pull your shoulders back. Unclench your jaw. If your jaw is clenched, unclench it, and massage over here as well. That does help. Brilliant. So recognizing you've been through trauma is the first step towards healing. Denial is incredibly common. So we all have that one person who says, my parents beat me as a child and I came out fine. Why is everyone complaining these days? Kids need to get beat. And you look at them and they're the most messed up person you've ever met in your life, but no one wants to tell them. You know, so denial is a very common issue that people go through, and and it makes sense, because if you've been through something as horrible as trauma, who wants to admit that something's wrong with them or they've been through something like that? Yeah. And again, back to the whole shame aspect. So in terms of treatment, there's loads and loads of different types of treatment. So you have CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which basically that helps mainly with anxiety. So if you have an OCD as well, so if you have like an anxious thought pattern of catastrophizing or always assuming the worst, that will help with it. EMDR, so I absolutely love EMDR. So it's a new piece of technology that no one really understands yet, but it's been incredible for PTSD and like flashbacks and that sort of stuff. So what it is you have like a stick. This is a very like rudimentary explanation, but you have like a stick like this that's on the bit that, what's it called? The thing that the camera tripod. So you have a stick like on a tripod, and then there's a light that goes up and down the stick. So you follow the stick with your eyes, you're following it, and as you're doing that, you're talking to the therapist about your trauma. And what happens is, and I really didn't go into detail about how trauma like affects your brain, because we'll be here for like 5 hours, but it messes up your neural networking. So what happens is when you're doing that type of therapy, they think, they're not really sure yet, but it disrupts the pathways that you've already established, and allows you to talk through the trauma without being triggered by it. Okay, So that's sort of roughly how it works, but we still don't know. I mean, it works amazingly, and it's all, you can also get this on the NHS, to be fair. Talking therapy, so that's just talking with a therapist about your experience. So somatic is brilliant. And we'll talk a little bit about this afterwards, but somatic is just moving your body. A lot of the times, people who've been through trauma are very disconnected with their body, especially something like sexual abuse. So somatic therapy just helps you find yourself through movement. So it can be things like dance. We'll talk about this afterwards as well, but dance, sport, martial arts, drama as well. So acting, that really helps. So trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is pretty much the same as that. Then you also have narrative exposure therapy. So this is mainly for complex trauma. So what you do is you chronologically lay out a patient's life and you put into context the events of their life at both positive and traumatic points. So when you're a child and you go through trauma, your understanding of the world is different than if you were an adult. So if I was to give you an example, if as a child you see your parents arguing, you see your parents getting really aggressive, really arguing, and that's just really scared you. That's made you so fearful, so scared. But later on, and as an adult, you realize, well, people kind of talk to each other that way anyways, or there was no risk of it being violent. Maybe as a child you magnified the issue and you thought, oh, my dad's going to start hitting my mum, but in reality they were just having a disagreement. So the point with this is that you put things into context, or you then understand, like, oh, my dad was shouting because he was under a lot of stress, or because he had just lost his job, or whatever. So the goal is to help patients refine and understand traumatic events by putting one's life events into context. You also have prolonged exposure therapy. So the patient is exposed to traumatic memories to help them understand and rationalize those events. So it's pretty successful, and it works mainly with sort of PTSD, panic attacks, and anxiety. And it's really good for OCD as well. So with the treatment, there's also self-care. So treatment, this is something that you'd have to get from a professional. Self-care is something you can do yourself, okay? And will cost you nothing. So exercise. So there is evidence to show that exercise mitigates the effects of trauma. So in particular, yoga, because of the breath work that is done with it. I could go into breath work for like 2 hours, but breath work is incredibly important for your system regulation. Because bearing in mind, you've lived however many years of a disrupted regulatory system. So you need to start slowly getting back to your original network and going back to what it was before. Martial arts. So martial arts is amazing for discipline and control. There's loads of different types out there. And I think especially for women, martial arts can be incredibly empowering if you're assaulted in some type of way. Not saying that, you're going to go out and beat up people on the street, but it allows you a certain level of agency. Also dancing is a really amazing way to release tension in the body. And it's because people who've gone through trauma have a disconnect with their body. So also mindfulness, so mindful breathing grounds people in the present. I would kind of swap this out with just doing dhikr. So if you do dhikr and you really focus on the words of Allah that you're saying, so a shafi is, the healer, if you really focus on that, Allah, making istighfar. There are certain du'as as well that you can, I'm really sorry, I haven't actually included it in this presentation, but there are certain, I hope it's going to be discussed today, but there are certain du'as as well that you can say, أعوذ بالله من الهم والحزن والعجز والكسل وغضب الدين وقهر الرجال. So the idea is to stop that constant buzz in your head of thoughts, and anxiety. So connection with others as well is really, really important. So withdrawing from others is a very common symptom of trauma. So making an effort to connect with others, even though it's difficult, is incredibly important, and it really supports your healing journey. And also having a balanced lifestyle, which kind of goes without saying. So, making sure you're getting your sleep and your diet, focusing on that. So here are some resources, and I'm going to send this as well as a document, inshallah. So emergency, if anything that's been said today is just you're finding it really triggering, and you're getting panic attacks and you can't get any support, if you need to call 999, then please do. Also dial 111. And these are some networks or helplines if you want to take a picture of that. I'll leave that for a second, or screenshot. And okay, I'm going to go to the next one. I'm going to send this all to Hanaa afterwards, inshallah, so you can pass that on. These are some books. So I've got three PDF copies that I can send. So The Body Keeps Score is the most amazing book ever about trauma and how it is in the body. And this is basically if you want to know the basics and how your brain is affected. My grandmother's hands, that's sort of generational trauma, and it didn't start with you. So I'm going to send these all as PDFs, inshallah. Also, okay, so at the end, we're going to be doing a mood repair. So I'm going to exit my screen. Can I stop share? Stop the share. And I'm going to ask about 5 of you. So mood repair is basically just talking about things that make us happy. So I'm going to randomly choose 5 people here, just for the sake of time, to tell me one thing that makes them smile, regardless of whatever mood they're in. So you can be in the worst mood ever. If you see or you hear or you do this particular thing, it will make you smile. So I'll go first. This morning I was in Hyde Park, and they have these like really beautiful green parakeets, which is like a type of parrot. And every time I hear the squawk, like I smile like that, you know, regardless of where I am, even if I'm really upset, that just really makes me happy. And I often go there to feed them. So I was there this morning, just like feeding them with apples and stuff, and they come and they rest on your hand, and it's very cute. So that's one thing that really helps my mood. I'm just looking, I'm going to ask Ikra, Shamim, would you be okay to unmute yourself and tell us one thing that makes you smile regardless of whatever mood you're in? You're unmuted, Ikra, but we can't hear anything. I'm sorry to put people on the spot as well by this, but I know if I ask, no one's going to volunteer. Ikra? Doing arts and crafts, brilliant, mashallah, amazing. Can I ask what you're doing now is trauma? By the way, Hamza is my older brother, so of course he needs to troll. Hamza, what makes you happy? Can you unmute yourself and tell us, or type what makes you happy?
For me personally, it's food, snacks, and all that stuff makes me happy. So yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, thank you for sharing that, Hamza. Can I also ask Sulaiman Ayub?
Right, Ikra Shamim said that her microphone isn't working, but
Okay.
she's spending time with her siblings.
Amazing, mashallah. It's good that you have nice siblings. Some of us don't.
For me,
No, I'm only joking.
Anytime like my cat like stretches, it just makes me smile.
Cats are the best. I've got a cat too. Does one more person want to share? Just unmute yourself. Looking at colourful flowers, beautiful, mashallah. Nature is always a really, really good mood lifter. Amazing. Brilliant. Okay, and I'm going to end it there. Now is the time for questions. If you have any questions at all, I think, Hamna, there's a way they can send it to you, right? But also you can type it here on the chat. I have access to the chat now.
Yeah, so we've been using a Q&A website, and we've got some questions that have come through. So how would you recommend talking to parents that don't believe in trauma, about trauma?
I think that's definitely a challenge. I would say focus on your own healing first. Just really focus on getting yourself better before you try to convince other people, because unfortunately you are going to run into instances, and it might not even just be from your parents, it could be from your friends, where you express something and it's not received the way that you want it. So I would really focus on healing first, getting better, getting your therapy, and your parents don't need to know. You know, I'll say this straight up. If your parents are against any kind of mental health support, or, you know, any kind of therapy that will get you better because of culture, or because this is not what we do, or because you don't have any issues, then I would say go ahead. Like, everyone here is an adult, you have access. And Hamna, please correct me if I'm wrong, does your university have mental health services?
Yeah.
They should, right? That are free to students. So I would say really take advantage of that, because therapy can be expensive privately. So take advantage and get the help and support that you need. You know, and unfortunately, you know, our parents do have the best of intentions for us, but often, you know, it might not translate into their actions. And sometimes they come from cultures where, you know, mental health is not a thing. You're not mentally ill, you know, that's not a thing. I've been through so much worse and look at me, you know, kind of thing. So I would say just focus on yourself, and you don't necessarily need to disclose that to parents unless you feel ready, unless you feel empowered to.
Thank you, that was really useful. We also got a few questions on the topic of how to approach family or friend who's dealing with trauma and how you can help?
I think so if you have a friend or family member who've gone through something, or you think they've gone through something, the number one thing is creating a safe space, a space of safety. People who've been through trauma have had the basic need of safety traits taken from them. Yeah, so you want to be able to provide that space. So, being there for them when they need, checking up on them constantly. And, I really, really would not recommend going to someone and being like, you've gone through this, let's have a chat about it. Let the person come to you. I've had friends who I've known for like years and years, like really good friend of mine. I've known her for about 15 years. And just last summer, she opened up to me about some sexual abuse that she had gone through. So it takes time. And when the person is ready, they will do it. But you can also show that you're supportive by, even just dropping in the conversation, like, oh, I read to this really good talk about trauma. And, these are all the support that people can get, kind of thing, be a bit low key about it. But I think with trauma, you just kind of had to let the person come to you, just let them know that you're there when they want to talk. And they might not ever talk. People go through trauma and talk about it when they're in their 40s and their 50s. So, don't take it upon yourself to try and fix someone.
Yeah, I definitely think it's about approaching it with some sensitivity.
100%.
We've got some questions related to Islam. So if my trauma affects my relationship with God, what could I do?
Affects relationship with God in what way? Sorry, I just want to be a bit more specific. Is there any more information given?
They've also added, especially if you have paranoia. I guess like if that's affecting like your belief and your faith and stuff.
Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry. If
my trauma affects my relationship with God, what can I do, especially if you have paranoia?
Okay, so I would say it's quite a complex question. You have a lot of people who actually have religious trauma. So if you've been abused by like a religious authority, that causes a lot. Like one of my mates, she was abused by her Quran teacher, and if she hears Quran, she'll have a panic attack. And she has a lot of guilt about that because she's like, oh, am I a bad Muslim because I don't pray, or I don't, I can't listen to Quran. And I would say, Allah is the most merciful. Allah is the most kind. Allah sees and Allah hears. I think we often have and I'm not giving any fatwas here, I'm just sort of talking from my personal experience, but I think we often have a very black and white approach to these sorts of things without taking into consideration the complexity of the person. So I would say just look, make lots and lots of dua, speak to Allah as though he's your friend, the same way you'd speak to your friend about, tell Allah like, yo, like I'm really having doubts, I'm really struggling with this belief thing, I'm really struggling with, and it could also be the way how you've been raised and the Islam that you've been taught. You might have been taught Islam in a way that is actually not helpful at all, and that's okay. It's okay to get to a point and start questioning and to have doubts and to have paranoia. That's totally fine, but I would say make lots and lots of dua if you want like an Islamic answer. Yeah. And then also seek help at the same time, and also just find out. So if there's any doubts, so for example, I remember a few years ago, I had like really big issues with how women, like my perception of like how women were treated like in Islam. And, you had all these hadiths and all these like, interpretations that I really, really struggled to accept. And then I got to a point where I was like, if this is Islam, like what's the point of being Muslim? Because it's all about the subjugation of a woman. And then I did my own research. I started to ask people, I started to find out. And, when you set out to research and you set out to understand the truth, Allah always opens a way for you. Allah always opens that path for you, okay? So yeah, that's what I would say for that. So dua and get help.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just ask a final question. Is unhealed trauma a reasonable reason to delay marriage or avoid new relationships?
100%. Guys, please do not get into any relationships unless you sort yourself out, because you are creating an even bigger problem for yourself. Like a lot of us, we go through trauma and then we get into relationships thinking that this person's going to fix us. It's not going to happen, and you're going to have a lot of breakdowns and you're going to have a lot of issues. So really, really take some time to work on yourself so that when you come into a relationship, you're a complete, you're more whole, because I don't like the fact that I guess trauma makes you less of a person, but you really want to be mentally stable, I think, for any relationship. So yeah, I would definitely say work on yourself, learn to love yourself, learn to know who you are. Like, who are you? A lot of people are robbed by trauma. They don't know who they are and like what they stand for and their views and their visions. So like, take some time to explore who you are. Do your self-love. Do things that you enjoy. Yeah, that's what I would recommend on that point.
Thank you very much. I think we'll pause it there unless anyone else has any pressing questions. Yeah, so Ikra Shamim said, bouncing off that question you just answered, what if someone is on their journey to find healing? Sometimes people's journey with trauma is a lifelong thing and manifest in different ways during their life.
That's a really good question, actually. I think, okay, look, when it comes to relationship problems, obviously I don't know the person individually and kind of what their situation is like, but starting your healing is always a good point. Being on that journey of getting help is always amazing, because you know, you can recognize, even if you have negative symptoms and you have, you know, symptoms of trauma, unhealed trauma, you know what they are, you can recognize them and you're on your way to dealing with them. Okay, whether you want to do that with someone, you know, or whether you want to, you know, have a partner to do that with, that's up to you and that's your choice, you know, and you can do either with or without. But I think it's a very good point that, you know, you have to just start your journey of healing first before you expect someone else to kind of do that for you. Yeah. And also, sorry, Hamna, can I share my screen for just like 1 second?
Yeah, of course.
I forgot to do that. Sorry, I just forgot to put my my details at the end here. So if you have any questions that you want to send to me, like here's my email, here's the Aafiyah website, you can send stuff on there as well. Here's our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. But yeah, if there's anything at all about what's been said today that you want to catch up on, please feel free. Yeah, if you take a picture, I'll take that off. Yeah. Hamna, is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. I found that actually really insightful and interesting, and from the lots of different questions we got, and I can tell a lot of people did as well. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you guys so much for giving me the space. I really do appreciate it.